Shalom, I'm Ryan White, and I'd like to invite you to join me on the Joshua Generation Show on Hebraic Roots Network. Help us spread the Word of God to all the nations. You can check us out on the schedule at HebraicRootsNetwork.com to see when our episodes are airing, or you can check us out on demand anytime on the web at HebraicRootsNetwork.com, or on your Roku device on your television. You can check us out as well on demand anytime from the comfort of your own living room. I hope to see you there. Shalom, everybody. I'm Ryan White, and welcome to Rooted in Torah Ministries teaching on the honor and shame in the ancient world and understanding the scriptures in light of this honor and shame. This is part 2 in this particular part of the whole title of the Gospel of the Suffering Servant, where we're going in and we're looking at Isaiah 53 from the context of honor and shame, and then as we get into the different parts, we're going to look at it from different angles and understand different aspects of it in order to tie it all in together into a much more wholesome understanding that just really brings to light a lot of things that have not traditionally been brought to light in understanding because we haven't understood the cultural aspect of the Isaiah 53 song, and honestly of a lot of scripture. You know, all of this here that we're talking about is not just related to Isaiah 53. That we're going to see this is all throughout Scripture. These are overarching themes, especially with honor and shame, and what we'll be talking about later on with justice and righteousness. So when we left off after part 1, we were talking about different ways that the body could receive shame or honor. Okay. Now, physical abuse was one of the key things that was used, other than exile, to bring shame to the body. And so, this is kind of how it would work, right? Your neighbor is doing something that you don't like, right? And this is a very realistic situation. This is what would happen. When these Gentiles, when they would come into the faith in Yeshua, suddenly they're leaving what they knew before, right? They're no longer worshiping their pagan gods. They've converted to what was in that first century was still considered Judaism. And so now they're no longer worshiping their pagan gods. And to their neighbors who were all pagans, that was a huge deal, because you're no longer creating what they would call a pax deorum, peace of the gods, right? The whole context of why the pagans offered sacrifices, why they worshiped their gods, it wasn't because they loved their gods. It was because they were trying to appease them in order to make sure that their gods weren't angry with them, or to basically bribe them by honoring them so that they would pour out blessings on them. And it really wasn't any sort of a personal connection. So what happens when your neighbor stops worshiping the gods? Well, now the gods are going to be angry, and they're going to take it out on everyone in their mindset. And so they would try to use these social sanctions in order to bring them back into the fold, okay, back into their pagan religion. And so they would start off. They would start off with mocking, ridiculing, but it would quickly escalate to physical abuse. Now, let's talk about physical abuse. What are the different ways that they would physically abuse a person in order to shame them? We already talked about stripping them naked, but backhanding was a huge insult. Does everybody remember in Matthew 5, verse 39, where Yeshua says, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn also the other cheek, right? What is he talking about? Is he saying, if a bunch of thugs get you cornered and they start pounding on your right cheek, that go ahead and just, let them pound on the other cheek? No, he's not saying that. You've got to look at the context, okay? First off, most people are right-handed back then. And in fact, if you look at scriptures kind of Interestingly, the scriptures kind of have this kind of distrust for left-handed people. That was one of the judges, if I remember right, was left-handed, right? And that's how they snuck the dagger past the guards. So anyways, if you're right-handed and you want to strike my right cheek, how are you going to do that? The only way for you to do that is to backhand. So that's why Yeshua specifically says, if someone strikes you on the right cheek, turn also the other. How do we know this? Well, we can go to the Mishnah for a verification. Now, we're not looking at the Mishnah for theology. We're just looking for cultural context, okay? So Mishnah Baba Kama 8.6 reads, Rabbi Judah said in the name of Rabbi Jose the Galilean, if he smacks him, he pays him 200 zuz. If it is with the back of his hand, he pays him 400 zuz. Right? So if it's a backhand, the fine is double. Why is that? Because a backhand was considered a huge assault on one's honor. Another way you could do this was by beard disfigurement. Right? Back then, it's not that it was a biblical command to have a beard. It was just that was considered a mark of honor. In fact, oftentimes, sometimes at least in Scripture, the same word that's used for beard is the same word that's used for elder, which is kind of interesting. But think about the story of King. I believe it was either King David or King Solomon. I think it was King David. But this other king died, and he sends this envoy out to mourn for this dead king. And his son, what he does is he shaves off half their beards and exposes their buttocks, right? And they go and David actually stops them and makes them stay in Jericho until their beard grows back. Why? Because he didn't want them to be publicly shamed with this loss of half a beard. Also, spitting was used. And we can see these in Isaiah 50, verse 6. Isaiah 50, verse 6. I gave my back to those who strike me, and my cheek to those who pluck out the beard. I did not cover my face from humiliation and spitting. For Yahweh Elohim helps me. Therefore I am not disgraced. Therefore I will set my face in flint. I know that I will not be ashamed. All right, so there we see pulling out of the beard and spitting as a way of shaming people. Flogging was used. We see this in Acts 5, verse 40 through 41. When the apostles, they take them out, and it says that they flogged them and ordered them not to speak in the name of Yeshua. And then they released them. And what did the apostles do? Well, it says they went out from the presence of the council, and they were rejoicing, considering it worthy to suffer shame for his name, right? For the name of Yeshua. So even though men tried to shame them, they considered it honor. And that's what we're going to see is that in God's honor system, when you're shamed for righteousness' sake, it's honor. God gives you honor for that. Mutilation, right? Oftentimes, even in the Middle East today, when someone's caught stealing, what do? They cut off. They cut off their right hand, and sometimes they cut off both of them. But oftentimes it's the right hand. Why? Because when they use the bathroom, that's their hand for cleaning themselves. Is the left hand, so now that's the only hand they're left with. But this cutting off of the hand is a way to shame them. You would also see this in ancient Near Eastern nations. Oftentimes when their slaves did something wrong, they would cut off their ears as a way to shame them, because if you cut off their ears, they can still work. But it's shameful to have part of your body mutilated. Now think about this. And this really kind of brings it into perspective for today, too, because we're seeing this starting to happen in the world today. Go to 1 Samuel 17, verse 51. It says, starting in verse 50, Then David prevailed over the Philistine, speaking of Goliath, with a sling and a stone, and he struck the Philistine and killed him. But there was no sword in David's hand. And so David ran and stood over the Philistine and drew out his sword, drew it from its sheath, and killed him, and cut off his head with it. When the Philistines saw their champion was dead, they fled. Why? Because David had brought them shame by cutting off the head of someone who was considered to be the most honorable person in their camp. He cuts off their head. That brings them shame. Now think about what's going on in the world today, over in the Middle East. What are they doing? You've got ISIS over there. They are over there, they're cutting off the heads of people. And in fact, I mean, that's not just ISIS, that's throughout Islam's history. They've always been cutting off the heads of their adversaries. Why is that? Is that the best way to kill someone? They do that because it brings shame on the other party. Now you think about that, and that starts to make a whole lot of sense, given the condition of what's going on today over there, because you've got this group who, you know, they're opposing everyone. I mean, they're killing a lot of their own people, and yet people are flocking to them. You've got people flying in from all over the world to join this Islamic State. Why? Because of what they're doing. When we understand it through the eyes of honor and shame, we see that they are actually shaming all their opponents, which brings honor to them in the eyes of their peers, those people who are going to ascribe honor to them. Okay, so that's something to really think about, is, you know, when you're looking at that, is realize that they're thinking honor and shame, and they think that's honorable. And it's our duty to show them that that is dishonorable and what God considers to be honorable. And then also, ultimately, death was used as shaming, but not just any death. Crucifixion was the most shameful death. In fact, you see that in Hebrews 12, verse 2. The author of Hebrews writes, "Fixing our eyes on Yeshua, the author and perfecter of our faith, who for the joy set before him endured the cross, despising the shame, and has sat down at the right hand of the throne of God." So Yeshua went through the shame of the cross in order to be sat down at the right hand of God. And what is that doing? That is bringing him honor, right? He was glorified by the Father because he endured the shame of the cross. Okay, and we're going to go a little bit later on, we're going to go really in depth, and we're going to look at precisely why crucifixion was such a shameful thing. It was so shameful that Roman citizens were not actually even allowed to be crucified. Only basically rebels and dissidents were allowed to be crucified. It was, you know, that's why Paul was not crucified. He was a Roman citizen, and so he was not even allowed to do that. All right, more ways that they would ascribe honor to a person. Works of honor, right? Winning a battle, funding public works, giving charitable donations. You even see this in today. What happens when someone gives a large donation to a hospital or somewhere else? What do? They put their name on a plaque, you know, donated by so-and-so. And of course, you know, what does Yeshua say about that? They've received their reward, right, in their little plaque there. But we still have that concept left over in our society, except for remember in their society it's zero sum. So when they did that, they're elevated, and this was actually very large for them. If you remember the story of the centurion, who the Jewish elders of that city the centurion lived in, who had a servant who was sick, it says that they went to Yeshua and they say, you know, Yeshua, can you come heal this guy because he has built a synagogue for our city. They're trying to show that this centurion was an honorable fellow because he had done something charitable and built a great synagogue for their city. Now, of course, ultimately, as believers in the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, where is the greatest works of honor? Of course, that's Torah observance. But we got to put this in context, okay? And this is really a lot of the times where we don't understand the arguments over works versus faith. Works versus faith, right? That's one of the big key things that is argued out. But without understanding the dynamic of honor and shame, we're not getting a full picture, not really able to fully analyze these texts. So let's look at some of the things that Yeshua says about honor and shame with your Torah observance. Let's go to Matthew 6, verse 1 through 4. And it reads, "Beware of practicing your righteousness before men, to be noticed by them. Otherwise you have no reward with your Father in heaven. So when you give to the poor, do not sound a trumpet before you, as the hypocrites do in the synagogues and in the streets, that they may be honored by men. Truly I say to you, they have their reward. But when you give to the poor, do not let your left hand know what your right hand is doing, so that your giving will be in secret, and your Father who sees it is done in secret will reward you. So, what is he saying here? He's saying that when you do your good works, do them not for your own honor. If that's what it takes, do them in secret. Do them so that no one knows, because you're not trying to gain honor. You're trying to give honor to the Father in heaven. By doing good works, it shows the honor of the King. And in fact, when we do good works, because sometimes you have to be seen, right? I mean, if you're giving it to, you're helping someone out, a lot of times you have to talk to them. So how does Yeshua say to handle that? Well, let's go to Matthew 5, verse 16. He says, "Let your light shine before men in such a way that they may see your good works and glorify your Father who is in heaven." Okay? When we do our good works, we need to make sure that it's not for us, not for people to go, "Wow, Ryan's such a great guy. He went out and he gave $20 to this homeless guy," or whatever, right? That's not the point. The point is, when you go out and you give something to someone, you say, "Look, this isn't from me. This is from our Father in heaven. You need to, give Him the glory. Don't give me the praise for helping you out. Give Him the honor, because He's the one who gave me the money and put me in the place where I could help you out to begin with as well." We also see this in 1 Peter 1, verse 12. He says, "Beloved, I urge you, as aliens and exiles, to abstain from the desires of the flesh that wage war with your soul. Conduct yourselves honorably among the Gentiles, so that they, though they malign you as evildoers, that they may see your honorable works and glorify God when He comes to judge." So even in the face of evil, we are to do our good deeds in such a way that people realize it's not Ryan, it's not you that is doing this good deed. You're simply following the instruction manual set out by the Father. And then they go, "Wait a minute, maybe the Torah is for today. Maybe the Torah is something that is incredible and is life-giving, that can fix the needs of society." And when they do that, what does that do? They realize that there is one true God, and they give glory to the one true God. That's how we give glory to Him, is by doing the deeds that He has set forth before us, and making sure other people know it's not me. I'm not doing this because I know the right moral way to do it. It's because I have a guide who has taught me how to live a life that is beneficial to others, right? So you can have works of honor, but once again, we can have works of shame, okay? So if you're in battle, of course, fleeing from battle, adultery was very, very shameful. You got to realize this is why adultery was dealt with so harshly in Scripture, that if a woman was caught in adultery, she was put to death. Because what happens with an adulterous bride, okay? Let's say she got pregnant. Well, who's the father? They didn't have paternity tests back then, so it calls into question the DNA, the lineage of this child. And if she's done it once, what about the other children? So now it's a huge, huge thing for a woman or a man really to go out and commit adultery. It brought utter shame upon that entire household. Okay. And remember, what is one of the biggest metaphors Yahweh uses for His relationship with Israel? It's that of a husband and a wife. And so when Israel goes out and plays the harlot with other gods, what does that do? That calls into question, when they do their good deeds, is it because they were following Baal, or were they following Yahweh? That brings shame on the name of Yahweh. And so that Yahweh deals with an adulterous bride, Israel, just like in the physical, they would deal with an adulterous bride there. And not just with adultery, right? Lewd public behaviors were also not allowed, and actually could lead to divorce if you look at the Mishnah and evidence there. Of course, murder, any criminal activity would be considered very shameful, lying. And then, so how would they deal with this? You've got someone who's lying, someone who's committing sin. They're acting shameful, but if they're acting shameful, what does that do? If they're part of your group, right, then that's bringing shame upon the whole group. We've got to understand, they did not live in an individualistic society. They lived in a kinship groups. So all of the house of Hillel, they were all, considered a kinship group. All of the house of Shammai, which these are the two major groups of Pharisees, they were a kinship group. So if someone from the house of Hillel does something wrong, it not only shames themselves, but it shames the whole group. And so there had to be a way of taking care of that. Well, of course, with the new believers, we're dealing with the same world, the same thing. So how do you deal with a brother who sins? Let's look at Matthew 18, verse 15 through 17. It says, "If your brother sins, go to him and show him his fault in private." In private. Why? Because you're not shaming him in private. "If he listens to you, you have won your brother. But if he does not listen to you, take one or two more with you and go, so that by the mouth of two or three witnesses, every fact shall be confirmed." So you take two or three witnesses and you confront the problem. This brings witnesses into it so that there could be proper judgment. And it's now an increased level of exposure to society, which is shaming them. And then listen to the last part. "If he refuses to listen to them, go and tell the assembly. And if he refuses to listen even to the assembly, let him be to you as a Gentile and a tax collector." What did we say earlier on? What's a tax collector? What's a Gentile? These are shameful, it's a shameful occupation, a shameful ethnicity, right? So what the whole context there is that if this person refuses to do this, they would treat him in a shameful manner. This is essentially exile. They're sending him into exile because of what he has done, because of his refusal to stop doing, right? It's not necessarily what he's done. It's the refusal to stop doing it. This is, unfortunately, one of these big problems. We deal with these social issues of homosexuality, of all these different sins that are out there, and adultery, divorce, all these things. And society says, "Oh, well, didn't Yeshua say to forgive?" Yeah, he did. But when think about the adulterous woman, he said, "I forgive you. Now go and sin no more." Not go and continue living an adulterous lifestyle. You're forgiven, right? The whole concept of forgiveness, of repentance, is stopping doing what you're doing and starting on the right path. So is it okay to accept someone who perhaps had a homosexual lifestyle or adultery or divorce or drugs or even a murderer? Yes, we can accept them, but they must change what they're doing. They have to change their ways. If they don't, you deal with them like this. You exile them. And unfortunately, in today's world, this really doesn't work because we're not part of a kinship group, right? Back then, if you were excluded by your kinship group, you were out on your own. You didn't go to work and have a whole different group of friends. You lived, you worked everything around your friends. So to be cut off from them was huge. And so that's actually one of the things with shame, is that shame was actually a lot of times a positive thing because it was a means of social control. You made sure that people didn't go off and do things that they shouldn't be doing because you could shame them. Now, of course, that assumes that the community is living a just and righteous life, which unfortunately, we know went downhill, but that's what Yeshua came to restore and create was communities where they lived with justice and righteousness, where they took care of each other, and where they lived according to the Torah, according to the true intent of the Torah, shall we say. Because as we're seeing here, what is he's talking about? He's talking about these people, when they're doing their Torah deeds, what are they doing them for? They're doing them for their own honor, whereas they should be doing them for the Father's honor. And when you shift your perspective to, I'm not doing these things so that other people can see, I'm doing it so that the Father can see, I would challenge you that that's going to shift your perspective on how to actually keep the commandments, right? No longer is it an argument about, how long is your tzitziot supposed to be? How are you supposed to perfectly observe the Shabbat and all these things? Instead of you trying to figure out how to have others see that you're doing it the right way, you see how the Father wants you to do it. What does the Scripture say? What is Yeshua's example? Yeshua went out and he healed people on the Shabbat. That was his way of showing this is the honorable thing to do on the Shabbat, right? Now, let's look at one more example here. Let's go to 1 Corinthians chapter 6, verse 1, because I want to hit on this, because this is also very important. This is going to kind of lead into the next topic under this, which we're going to be talking about, which is justice and righteousness. Okay? It reads, "Does any one of you, when he has a case against his neighbor, dare to go to the law before the unrighteous and not before the saints? Or do you not know that the saints will judge the world? If the world is judged by you, are you not competent to constitute the smallest law courts? Do you not know that we will judge angels? How much more the matters of this life? So, if you have the courts telling you the matter of this life, do you appoint them as judges who have no account to the assembly? I say this to your shame. It is so that there is none among you who is wise enough to be able to decide between his brethren, but a brother goes to law with another brother, and that before unbelievers." Paul is saying here, look, the Torah teaches us how to do righteous judgments. What right do you have to go before some pagan judge and ask him to decide a case? This is the whole idea of studying the Scriptures, about studying the Torah, is understanding the framework, the principles of God's system, which are laid out in the Torah, which is based on what? It's based on how God is, right? It's not an arbitrary set of rules that God just gave to the Jews to see if they would do it. It's the very character of Yahweh is what the Torah is. And when we study that, when we understand that, that's going to teach us how to judge properly. Instead of, if I have a dispute with you, instead of me going to the cops or to the court and having a lawsuit pressed on you, we go to the assembly and we say, "Hey, pastor, we've got an issue. We want you to decide on this, and we will submit ourselves to your authority." Right? Otherwise, it's shameful that the believers have to go to unbelievers in order to render righteous judgments. Right? We should be the ones who are mature enough as a body to be able to do these things and render these righteous judgments. Okay, we're getting close to the end of this half hour, but what I want to do really fast is let's talk about the words associated with honor and shame. Okay, so obviously honor and shame are on there. Glory, remember the word glory and honor come from the same word, kavod in the Hebrew and doxa in the Greek. Now, sometimes these words are translated from other words, but this primarily is where they come from. Reputation, praising someone, the name is associated with that. Something very interesting, blessed, right? Not the Hebrew word baruch for bless, but blessed, like the Beatitudes. Blessed are the poor in spirit. The Hebrew word is ashrei, or in the Greek it's makarios. That it means honorable. These people are honorable. And then righteousness is also tied in there. Shame, on the other hand, we've got, of course, shame, disgrace, scorn, reproach, slander, blasphemy, wickedness. And then just like we have blessed, guess what we have? We have the opposite of that. We have woe, which in the Hebrew is hoi, and in the Greek, I'm going to butcher the pronunciation of this, but it's oei. But we see that in your English every time that Yeshua says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees." He's not trying to get their attention. He's not saying, "Whoa, scribes and Pharisees." He's saying, "Whoa, shame on you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites." All right? So those are some very key terms. We're going to take a quick break here, and we will be right back. Shalom, I'm Ryan White, and I really hope that you've been enjoying all the incredible content here on Hebraic Roots Network. There's a lot of people out there who are dying to receive the good news of Yeshua, to understand the scriptures from a proper context, from the Hebraic context of scriptures. And we love to be able to provide this information to everyone. But you know what? We need your support, because unfortunately, these things don't come for free. Help us provide the support for us to send this message out to the entire world. You can go onto HebraicRootsNetwork.com or give us a call at 1-800-657-9820. And there's several options. You can join the Tabernacle team, which is a $100 a month donation. Or you can use the Gideon's Army option, which is a $50 donation. Or at any time, you can choose to do a one-time donation of any amount. Any amount can help send the message out to the entire world so that we can all know and love our Master Yeshua. All right, welcome back. In God's honor system, it's very different from the world's honor system. It's very different from the honor system that existed in the first century. And this was one of the hardest things about Yeshua's message for the people, was that they were so used to these concepts of what was honorable and what was shameful. They had developed into essentially a religion. And I use that term in a not so good way. When you look at the Torah really doesn't have religion in it per se. It was a lifestyle. It was a kingdom. It was a way of doing things. It was your life, right? And the Torah was not meant as 613 commandments. That was a little checklist. Did I do this one? Did I do this one? Did I do this one? It was meant as a way, as we just saw earlier on, it was meant as a way to show you how to judge. And judgment, you got to realize, judgment isn't always in a negative connotation. The concept of judgment, or mishpat in the Hebrew, is how you operate, right? Your judgment, every time you do something, you're making a judgment, right? If I decide to reach to the right, or to my left, I just made a judgment, right? And the Torah is there to teach us how to make proper judgments, how to when we approach a situation, we know what to do. And that's very different from the U.S. law codes. You know, the U.S. law codes, it's just this set of laws. And what does the judge do? Well, he determines, did you break this law? No. Did you break this law? Did you break this law? Oh, you broke this law. So we're going to charge you according to this law, and this has this penalty. That's not how the Torah was established. You don't see that sort of concept in there. It was established on, and this is why it's all in a narrative framework. This is why it's, you see, before you have the thing with picking up sticks on the Sabbath. You had an actual example of someone breaking the Sabbath there by picking up sticks. It shows you these examples, so when you get to these situations that fall outside of the written letter of the law, that you know how to properly operate. Well, the problem is that when Israel came back from the Babylonian exile, what did they do? They had turned it into a religious system. They had turned it into, Torah observance with, making sure I'm doing it the right way, blowing my shofar before I do this. And in doing so, they ended up actually overriding the commands of God. You think about what does Yeshua say? He says, you tie a heavy burden on the people that they're not able to bear. Is that a description of the Torah? No, the Torah was never described as a heavy burden. What did they do? They added on all these things. Now, does that mean you can't ever, interpret this and say, well, now we have stop signs and the Torah doesn't cover stop signs, so we can't have any laws of stop signs? No. You take Torah principles and you apply that. The problem is that they were overriding Torah principles. We'll see this in the next chapter, but they had something called prosbul in the first century. And what was prosbul? It was something that was overriding the Shemitah year. So that instead of releasing people on the Shemitah year from their debts, you were able to, through this legal mumbo jumbo, be able to override them. Why? Because they're trying to, it's greed and it's about self-righteousness, glorifying themselves. Yeshua accused them of being whitewashed tombs. On the outside, yeah, they look great, but on the inside, they're dead. Now, again, not everyone back then was like this, but there were people who were doing this. They had this overtly religious attitude towards it, where everything was just about what you do and not about what was in the heart, about what was guiding your actions. And this is what God wants, is his honor system is based on our proper actions that render honor to him and not to ourselves. So let's look at some of these principles in the scriptures. Okay, so the pursuit of righteousness and covenant loyalty, we see this in Proverbs 21, verse 21. It reads, "He who pursues righteousness and loyalty finds life, righteousness, and honor." Okay, and what is the pursuit of righteousness? Yahweh says in the Torah, he says, this will be your righteousness. Keeping the Torah will be your righteousness. But we got to remember, how do we keep the Torah? Do we keep it according to our own definition of it? Or do we keep it according to his definition of it and Yeshua's understanding of it? Right? Yeshua, what does Yeshua say about it? He says, "Woe to you, scribes and Pharisees, hypocrites, for you tithe the mint, the anise, and the cumin, but you have neglected the weightier matters of the Torah, justice, mercy, and faith." So you know what that word weighty is? If you take it to the Greek, and then you take the Greek back to through the Septuagint, it's from the Hebrew word kavod. Kavod means something that's heavy, something that's glorious, something that's honorable. What are the honorable things of the Torah? Justice, mercy, and faith. These you should have done without neglecting the others. So he's not saying that the little minutia, the mint, the anise, and the cumin aren't important, but he's saying that without justice, mercy, and faith, they mean nothing. Okay, we've got it's a shift of mindset. Instead of keeping the commandments in order to make sure that you look the way that you think that God is saying you need to look in the Torah, let's look at it from how God wants us to look at it in the Torah. Let's take a great example that we see in the Hebrew roots movement. Tzitziot, the tassels, right? God commands that you put the tassels on the four corners of your garments, okay? And he says you put a thread of blue in there. And so this leads to discussions, of course, of, well, what color of blue? Is it from the snail? Is it just any color of blue? Is it light blue? I've even heard it's black now. Where do we tie our tzitzit to? Do we tie them to our belt? Do we have to wear a talit katan? Do we have to create a robe and wear the robe? How long are the tzitzit supposed to be? Are they supposed to be tiny, short? All these different avenues that we take. But see, we're looking at that from a religious perspective. Okay? If you go back and you study from the ancient Near Eastern research about tzitzit, you'd realize quickly that back then, everyone wore tassels. Everyone wore tzitzit on their garment. It wasn't exclusive to Israel. All of the nations wore them. Now that's kind of interesting. Was God copying the nations? No, God was not copying the nations. Why? Because he said, "But you shall put a thread of blue on the corners of your garments." Now, if we go back and we study out blue dye back then, we'd realize that they don't have blue dye that was just readily available. They used what was called the murex snail. And in order they've proven this archaeologically, they've found actually tzitzit from the 1st century, and they've tested the dye and everything, and they've actually found these places where they had the snails, and they would gather them, and they would have to drill a little hole into them, and they'd extract the dye, and there's just a minuscule amount. It took them 12,000 snails to produce 1 gram of dye. Now, I don't know, I'm not a person who knows much about fabric, but 1 gram of dye is not a whole lot. I don't know if that gets you a whole tzitzit or not, but you can see that 12,000 snails to get 1 gram of dye, guess what? Blue is going to be a very expensive material to have something dyed blue. In fact, that's why we get the term royal blue because only royalty could afford to pay people to go out and drill little holes into snails and extract the dye. So what does this have to do with tzitzit? God commanded that every single Israelite is to have a thread of blue in order for you to remember to keep the commandments. Well, how does that help you remember to keep the commandments? Because you see on everyone else, and you got to realize these tzitzit, different people would wear different ones. If you were rich, you would wear an elaborate tzitzit. If you were poor, you would just wear maybe just like a little fringe of thread there. Okay, so they essentially were a badge of status, i.e. a badge of honor. Okay, so if someone has a thread of blue on 4 corners of their garments, that's expensive. That's very expensive back then. And so when, instead of me arguing about where do you tie them on and this and that, when I see my Israelite brother, I go, he's got a thread of blue. I remember he has value. In God's eyes, he is honorable. And therefore, we have to act accordingly. Right? I act as if he is a son of the living God because he is a son of the living God. And that tzitzit was to remind me of that. And so when you start looking at the commandments, and we could go through all the commandments and just pick them apart, when you look at them from the correct cultural understanding, you'll start to see that every single one of them was about taking care of the oppressed, about raising people up, about restoring them, their honor and giving them honor. And when we look at that, and we understand that principle, suddenly our own Torah observance will be based on giving people honor. Let's look at an example here. I want to go to Isaiah 58. Okay? And in Isaiah 58, it's very, very interesting when we look at this concept of religion versus true Torah observance. He says, "Cry aloud, do not hold back. Raise your voice like a trumpet and declare to my people their transgression and to the house of Jacob their sin." So his people are in transgression and sin. They're doing something wrong, right? And they need it declared to them. "Yet they seek me day by day and delight to know my ways. As a nation that has done righteousness and has not forsaken the ordinances of their God. They ask me for just decisions. They delight in the nearness of their God." They're a people who believe that they are drawing near to God, right? They delight in nearness. They seek after him day by day. They delight to know his ways. These are people who are really close to God, right? But what does he say? He says, you say to me, "Why have we fasted and you did not see? Why have we humbled ourselves and you did not take notice? Behold, on the day of your fast, you find your own desire and drive hard all your workers. Behold, you fast with contention and strife and to strike with the wicked fist. You do not fast like you do today to make your voice heard on high. Is it a fast that I have chosen for a day for a man to humble himself? To bow down his head like a bulrush and spread sackcloth and ashes on his bed, to make himself shameful as an outward observance while he's driving hard his workers, striking with contention, strife, and all these things?" Yahweh says in verse 6, and remember, this fast we're talking about, this is Yom Kippur. "Is this not the fast I have chosen, to loose the bonds of wickedness, to undo the bands of the yoke, and let the oppressed go free, to break every yoke? Is it not to divide your bread with the hungry and bring the homeless into your own house?" You starting to see that when we look at Yahweh's system through the eyes of just outward religious observance, of just trying to draw near to him by doing the commandments the way that we think, instead of through the context that he shows us with doing justice and righteousness and preserving and restoring the honor of our brother, it's all for nothing. We need to shift our perspective and look at his commandments. And not just look at it for ourselves. We need to teach other people, especially those hypocrites out there in the world, the atheists who get in there and they read, "Oh, there's slavery in the Old Testament. There's this, there's that, all these terrible things. God's terrible," right? That's what they're saying. It is our duty to stand up and say, no, we need to explain these things. We need to be able to take these things and show people that God actually has honor, that his ways are the best, and that he is the one that when we honor him, that he will in turn honor us. And that's kind of God's modus operandi, right? He doesn't rescue the honorable people of the world. What does he do? He goes after and he saves, he looks after, he rescues those people who the world considers to be shameful. Look at 1 Corinthians, verse 26. Consider your calling, brethren, that while there were not many wise according to the flesh, not many noble, but God has chosen the foolish things of this world to shame the wise, and God has chosen the weak things of this world to shame those things that are strong. And the base things of this world and the despised God has chosen, the things that are not, so that he may nullify the things that are, so that no man may boast before God. God chooses the weak things. I mean, think about even Israel. What does he say of Israel? He said, I didn't choose you because you earned it. You were the weakest, the smallest of the nations. And I chose you, and I brought you out of the land of Egypt. That's what God does, and that's what he in turn asks us to do, is to go out and rescue the oppressed, the weak, the widows, the poor, the orphans, those who the world esteems as dishonorable, as not worthy. He asks us to go out and to restore their honor. In God's kingdom, there's no competition. In the body of Messiah, there should never be any competition for honor. Okay? Look at 1 Corinthians 12, verse 22. We'll start in verse 20. Now Messiah has been raised from the dead, and the first fruits of those who are asleep. For since by man death came, by man also came the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, so also in Messiah all will be made alive. That's interesting because remember, death is one of those ways of shaming people, and yet through a man came resurrection from the dead, restoring of honor. And we'll get into that more later. But now each in his own order. Messiah the first fruits, and after that, those who are at Messiah's at his coming. Then the end comes when he hands over the kingdom to the Father, to God and the Father. Then he has abolished all rule and all authority, for he must reign until he has put all things under him. And actually, I think I'm in the wrong reference there. That was 1 Corinthians 15, but that one does have a lot to do with honor there. Let's go to 1 Corinthians 12, verse 22. Or let's start in verse 20. But now there are many members, but one body. The eye cannot say to the hand, I have no need of you. And again, the head to the feet, I have no need of you. On the contrary, it is much truer that the members of the body which seem to be weaker are necessary, and the members of the body that we deem less honorable, on these we bestow a more abundant honor, and less presentable members become even more presentable, whereas our more presentable members have no need of it. But God has so composed the body, giving more abundant honor to those which have lacked, so that there may be no division in the body, but that the members may have the same care for one another. And if one member suffers, all members suffer with it. And if one member is honored, all members rejoice with it. You see, the world's honor system is based on competition within the body, right? If the body of Messiah was the world system, people would, I would be competing against you and you against me. And so if I got honored, you'd be lowered down and there'd just be this strife. But Paul is saying here, look, we are not the world. We do not compete for honor. What God has done is he's honored those people who we've considered to be less honorable. He's raised them up. This is what's interesting, okay? Think about this. In the American system, what do? When someone's poor, the solution is to take from the rich and give to the poor, so that we bring down the rich and bring the poor up a little bit to level everyone out. That's not how God's system works. It's not about bringing down someone so that someone else can feel better. In God's system, He raises those people who are less honorable. They get honored so that they're at the same honorable level as everyone else. We all share the same honor status, right? And so if there's members in your congregation who are treated less honorably, it is your duty to go out there and do what is necessary to raise them up, to give them the knowledge, give them the money, whatever it is, to restore their honor status so that everyone is equal in the kingdom. Because if one member is dishonored, all of us are dragged down. So instead of dragging everyone down to the same level, we need to be in the kingdom where everyone is raised to the same level. It's about raising up, not about lowering those down who are ahead. And honestly, I mean, that's what Yeshua talks about. Not just Paul, but Yeshua quotes this principle. Matthew 20, verse 25 says, Yeshua called them to himself and said, "You know that the rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their greatest men exercise authority over them. But it is not that way among you. But whoever wishes to become great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first shall become your slave. Just as the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve and give his life as ransom for many." That's the system. That this is not to say that there shouldn't be leaders, that there shouldn't be a pastor, that there shouldn't be elders, but we got to realize that those positions, that doesn't elevate someone. That puts them at a status where they're supposed to be pushing those other people up, not elevating themselves up, but pushing up those people who need help because of their situation in life or whatever, elevating their status so that we all are honored in God's eyes, so that we all are a whole body, right? One body, not a divided body, not Jew and Gentile battling it out. We are one body, and when someone has dropped down in their honor or their whatever that is, it's our duty to raise them up. We're to be, those who have been given a position are to be servants of others, to raise them up. Okay? And this was very strange. This was very strange for them in that culture. In the Greco-Roman world, there was no such, in fact, the concept of humility was, if you look at their writings, some of the Greek writers, they considered it to be abject and unworthy to act in humility. That was absurd to do. And yet, you've got Yeshua coming on the scene and teaching people you need to have humility. It was a complete shift in mindset. And oftentimes, we look at, especially, coming in the Hebrew Roots movement, we get the Torah and we're all excited. We got the Torah, yay! Why weren't the believers in the New Testament? Why didn't Paul just constantly hammer in, keep the Torah? Well, first off, we got to understand, they didn't have a lot of paper back then. They couldn't just go down to Walmart or Kinko's or wherever and grab a big sheaf of paper. They had it was a limited commodity, so they had to preserve space. So the concept of Yeshua writing, of saying, until heaven and earth pass away, not one jot or tittle shall pass away from the Torah, that right there says, hey guys, go look at all that stuff that's already on paper. We don't need to reaffirm everything there. So what did the New Testament writers, what do they focus on? They focus on the issues at hand. And the issues at hand are the people coming out of this worldly system in Judaism where they're worried about what other people think about them, and especially the Gentiles who are coming out of pagan, Greco-Roman paganism, where they're going to have neighbors. I mean, think about this. What happened for you when you stopped keeping Christmas? All of a sudden, for some people, all of a sudden, your family members take huge offense. Oh, you're not keeping Christmas, and what do they do? They try to shame you. You shouldn't be doing this. This is not right. They're using that same technique. Now think about this. Take that experience and multiply that by like 10,000. That was the intense pressure that a Gentile a person who was a former Gentile and they became a believer in Yeshua, that's what they experienced, was this intense social shaming by everyone that they used to hang out with. Even their job. If you were in the employ of someone, they would expect you to come to parties where they had food offered to idols. They would have all sorts of sexual things going on. They would have all sorts of improper things that you could no longer participate in because you're now a believer. And now suddenly you're not going to do that. Well, they're going to do their best to shame you and try to bring you back in, because they don't want to kill you, because if they kill you, they lost you. They're trying to recover you by doing these shaming methods. And so the bulk of the New Testament is focused on teaching or building up the body of believers to show that no matter what they do, don't worry about what they do. You worry about what God thinks is honorable. Don't worry that they're stealing from you. Don't worry that you're getting beaten, that you're being spit on, accused, thrown in jail, even put to death. Because why? We know even if we die, that Yahweh is faithful to resurrect us from the dead because he resurrected Yeshua from the dead. That is the evidence of our faith. So it doesn't matter what they say to you. You need to stay firm to the faith. And so that's these contexts of these things. And unfortunately, when we get away from the honor and shame culture, we kind of miss what's being said there. Think about, I think it was in Colossians, where it talks about, don't worry about what men talk about with feasts and new moons. Let me see if I'm right here. Colossians 2, verse 14. Verse 16 says, therefore, no one is to act as your judge in regard to food or drink or respect to festival or the new moon or the Shabbat day, which are a mere shadow of things to come. And then the English translations here are terrible. They say, but the substance belongs to Christ. Well, if you know a little bit of Greek, you'll know that that is a terrible translation. It says here, tu soma de tau Christon, right, or Christou, which is literally means, soma is the Greek word for body. It's saying, don't let anyone judge you except for, dia, it means but or yet or except for the soma, the body of Messiah. He's not saying some weird, that doesn't even make any sense, but the substance belongs to Christ. He's saying here, only let the body of Messiah judge you with regard to food, to Shabbat, to feast days. Because why? Because the rest of the world, they were judging them, and they were creating an intense pressure on them to conform through these shaming techniques. Okay? Honor is to be ascribed when you are shamed for righteousness' sake as well. It's just kind of interesting. If you go to Luke 6, verse 22, Yeshua says, blessed, remember that word blessed, makarios, is honorable. You are honorable when men hate you and ostracize you and insult you and scorn your name as evil for the sake of the Son of Man. As long as it's for the sake of the Son of Man, not because you're doing something wrong, but because of the sake of Yeshua, because of the sake of the gospel, because of the sake of the Torah, in God's eyes, that is honor. And he will ascribe to you honor. And most importantly, before we finish up here, is understanding that we accept honor from the Father. John 5, verse 41. He says, I do not accept glory from human beings, but I know that you do not have the love of God in you. If I come in my Father's name, you do not accept me. If another comes in his own name, you will accept him. How can you believe when you accept glory from one another and do not seek the glory that comes from the one who alone is God? We need to worry not about what the world thinks, not what about our family thinks, what our coworkers think, but what God thinks. He is the one who is going to honor us, and through honoring us is going to come the resurrection of the dead.